L&M Railway was one of the most bizarre and mismanaged companies to have survived out of the Victorian age. It was known to all those who had the misfortune to travel on its antiquated rolling stock, hauled by barely functioning engines, as the late, slow and miserable, or by those with a more literary bent as the long, sorrowful mortification. But somehow, through all its vicissitudes, it managed to limp on right up to amalgamation in 1923. The general day-to-day incompetence of the board was surpassed when they almost precipitated a collapse in the whole economic base of the country and nearly plunged the world into war some years before the great conflict of 1914. This occurred in those long summer days of the reign of Edward VII, when the empire was at its height and toilers in the dark satanic mills were allowed a whole day off every week to let their lungs recover from their soot-stained labour. It was not uncommon for railway companies to organise special excursion trains for these poor benighted folk and their families to out-of-the-way places where they could lie on actual green grass and look at a sky unsullied by black, belching smoke. The destinations for these jollies would be known well in advance, even though the interest in the ancient castle or sandy cove or upland moor would be perfunctory. The real attraction lay in the crates of brown ale that would be carried on board the trains and which would be steadily consumed over the day. Lemonade for the kids and wives, of course. Danger signals should have been apparent when the LS&M started advertising its Sunday excursions as mystery tours. There were enough mysteries in the day-to-day runnings of the railway without actually making a feature of them. However, enough people were willing to take the risk, thinking only of the extra crates of brown ale that could be stowed in the guard's van. For the LS&M, this was an opportunity to use its permissions to run over other companies' metals to access some of the more far-flung parts of its empire. And so it was that one sunny July morning the LS&M Mystery Tour started off from somewhere near Birmingham, heading in a generally southerly direction. The passengers on board consisted almost entirely of employees of the Midlands Munitions Manufactory, along with significant amounts of brown ale and wives and kids. Spirits were high and got higher as the day progressed. The driver, one Samuel Johnson, was a late replacement, the rostered driver not being aware that he was meant to be working that day and had booked himself on an excursion with a rival company for a well-earned rest. Johnson, of course, had absolutely no idea where the train was meant to be headed and set off following where the points and signals directed. After a couple of hours, they found themselves on a branch line somewhere in very rural Dorset or Somerset or even Wiltshire. All was charming and peaceful. The sun continued shining, the green hills rolled by, sheep baaed and cows mooed. And then the engine as all LS&M engines were wont to do, ground to a halt for no apparent reason whatsoever. Possibly a steam pipe had ruptured, maybe the brakes had locked on, the valve gear had seized, probably all of that and more. The driver had absolutely no idea where he was, and when the fireman walked back to consult the guard, he found him insensible among the brown ale with a bottle opener in his hand and a quantity of empties strewn around the van. There was nothing for it. Even though there was not another train expected till Thursday, they put out warning flags and track detonators at regulated distance, and the fireman set off to find a signal box somewhere. Meanwhile, the passengers, completely unaware of the misfortune that had befallen their engine and thinking they had arrived at their destination, began climbing down and spilling out into the surrounding fields. Picnic blankets were spread, the crowts of brown ale were discovered and opened, and everyone began enjoying themselves. The driver, unable to make the mob understand this was just a temporary state of affairs, decided to join them. So far, all is amiable. The Midlands munition manufactory was a foremost supplier of arms to the government and had contracted to supply a considerable shipment to a certain country in order to secure a potential alliance and to sweeten a trade deal involving access to that country's fabulous mineral wealth before the Russians or Germans, or worse, the French, snapped them up. The MMM had been working flat out on this very high security contract for some months now, and everyone felt elated that such a huge undertaking had been achieved on time. Or nearly so, as the deadline pressed. All it needed was for the highly skilled workforce to machine several thousand small widgets before the coming Friday. And so it was that when the entire highly skilled workforce failed to appear for work on that Monday morning, it was immediately apparent that there was something seriously wrong. Nobody knew what had happened to the workers. They had all boarded a train on Sunday morning and not been heard of since. The only possible explanation was that sabotage was involved and telegrams were exchanged with Whitehall. Within minutes, pale-faced officials were convening meetings and trying to decide whether it was more likely to be the Russians or the Germans or the French who were responsible. As a safety precaution, orders were sent to military units at channel ports and to the naval Grand Fleet to put to sea. And, as is the way of things, despite the secrecy, a cabinet minister decided it would be prudent to sell his holdings in certain areas, and the stock market began to head downwards at an alarming rate. The managing director of MMM, being a man of honour, decided that there was only one course of action for him to take, and he had taken his prized and patented pistol from its case when one of the shop floor managers burst in to tell him that a trickle of workers had just staggered through the front gate. Blearily, they were clocking on and heading for their machines and benches. Within a few minutes, the trickle became a flood, and by early afternoon, the entire workforce were at their places. The machining of the widgets was slow and painful, with many rejects before the order was finally completed. But despite it all, it was delivered on time. Government officials smiled again, military units were stood down, a certain cabinet minister cursed as the stock market rapidly climbed above where it had been, and a patented pistol was polished and put back in its case. Of course, the whole affair was hushed up with the utmost rigour, and for that reason no report was ever published to show just how close we came to a global conflict and the part that the LS&M had played. And the directors of the company breathed a sigh of relief. One positive outcome, though, was for a farmer in rural Somerset, or Dorset, or Wiltshire, who had allowed a trainload of day trippers to sleep in his barn for £1 a head before organising a fleet of wagons with his neighbours to carry them at another 6pence each to the mainline station a couple of miles away. He had himself then collected nearly 1,000 empty brown ale bottles and, as was the custom at that time, had returned them to the brewery for 3pence each. Altogether an excellent cash crop. He decided to use some of this windfall on a few shares in the LS&M in gratitude for the good fortune it had brought him. Sadly, as was the way of things then, they never paid a dividend. Thank you for listening to that 10-minute railway tale. There will be another one along